Broadway is my beat, is my beat. From Times Square to Columbus Circle, the gaudiest, the most violent, the lonesomest old-time radio show in the world. Welcome to Broadway Is My Beat, the only recap podcast dedicated to the old-time radio detective show Broadway Is My Beat. I'm your host, Adam Cecil. I write Nightwater, a late-night pop culture newsletter full of refreshing content to quench your thirst. And you can find out more and subscribe at nightwater.email. That is a URL, nightwater.email. But for now, close your eyes and imagine a world before email newsletters, before podcasts, before the internet. It's 1949. The centerpiece of your living room is a large box with a few dials and a massive speaker grill on the front. It's the radio, and that's how you get your daily dose of fiction entertainment. Television is not yet the medium of choice for scripted shows, and listeners can tune into everything from westerns to crime dramas to spy thrillers to family comedies to superhero serials. Today, we're going to be recapping an episode of Broadway Is My Beat, which was a crime drama that ran on CBS from 1949 to 1954, originally starring Anthony Ross as Detective Danny Clover. The production moved from New York to LA 3 months into the run, with Larry Thor taking over for Ross and the new writers Martin Fine and David Friedkin inheriting the show. It's a very melancholy show, as you'll hear later on. It's most well known for these monologues from Clover where he philosophizes on life, crime, and the city. Very, very dramatic. My guest today, who will be joining me to discuss the show, is Drew Ackerman. He's the creator, writer, and host of the Sleep With Me podcast, the podcast that puts you to sleep. He has recorded over 1,000 episodes of bedtime stories for adults since 2013, including one based on Nightwater, which you can find in our feed or his feed. So we're going to be discussing the episode, The Ben Justin Murder Case. Ignore me later in the episode when I call it the Ben Justin case. You got to throw murder in there, in my opinion. If you want to listen to it before you hear our discussion, you can find a link to the episode on archive.org in our show notes, or you can head to the episode page on nightwater.email. I've embedded the entire file on the site for your listening pleasure. And we'll also be playing plenty of clips from the episode during our discussion. So if you don't want to listen to it, wait for the clips. All right. Without further ado, let's get into our conversation about Broadway Is My Beat. Drew Ackerman, welcome to Broadway Is My Beat, Is My Beat. Would love to just hear a little bit about you and Sleep With Me and, your relationship to the recap podcast, because Sleep With Me, in some ways, is a recap podcast.
Yeah, I was before we got on today, I was trying to recap the name of, I'm like, is it My Beat is Broadway Is My Beat, or Broadway Is My Beat is My Beat, or Broadway, and so that's kind of my skill set, is misremembering enough details in TV recaps. I make a show called Sleep With Me. That's a bedtime story podcast for adults. It's kind of like calling your weird friend on the phone and talking to them, and you're not listening to them, and they're just saying, hey, tell me about this old-time radio show you listen to. But instead of covering stuff that's maybe actually interesting or the exciting parts, I just drone on and on and on. Even in our discussion, I'm sure I was tempted to go too deep on things and be like, okay, is this really going to be necessary for this discussion? But deep in the details so that you don't have to listen is my kind of recapping.
I know that, part of the origin story for Sleep With Me is that when you were a kid, you used to listen to like comedy radio to help you fall asleep. So I'm curious about like your relationship with radio, like whether you ever listened to like old time radio, like, these kind of fiction shows.
Yeah, so I was glad you asked that because I have three very specific old time radio memories. My brother was really big into listening to it, and we shared a room, so I'd kind of listen to it with him. But it was, I guess I would pay too much attention, so it didn't necessarily help me sleep as so much to just kind of chill out and lie in our beds. And then when I was growing up, if you donated to NPR, you usually got this extra catalog. I think it was called Signals, and it was like stuff NPR adjacent you could buy, like Lake Wobegon, like recordings and a lot of old time radio stuff. And so I would page through that and be like, one day when I'm like have $100,000 or whatever, I'm gonna like start listening to all this old time radio. So those are two memories. The most specific one I have has to do with the bathroom. I was visiting Emerson College as a high school senior, and you like stay overnight there to decide, oh, is this the right school for me or whatever. And a lot of their dorms were built into like these old like single room occupancy hotels. So like with a European style bathroom at the end of the hall and only like one bathroom for like 20 rooms. And I had to go to the bathroom. And I knocked on the door, and no one responded. But I was like, oh, okay, I'll wait. And I could hear two things in there. There was a bathtub, which is very rare for a college dorm bathroom. And someone was in the bathtub listening to old time radio. And so had this experience of like just sitting there now, like as an audio spectator, listening to the sounds of the tub, and this person just imagining them in there, chilling out, listening to old time radio. And anytime I think of old time radio, I think of like someone. Hopefully, how they were listening was like on a sink in a safe distance. If you're listening, kids.
Yeah, no slippage there.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, given your history and kind of what you heard on the radio, was this your first time hearing Broadway Is My Beat?
It was. And so this was my first taste of Clover level action, and it was awesome. Yeah.
What would you say, struck you about it that was maybe different or interesting than what you've heard before?
What was different about it? I mean, definitely the structure of the show with these kind of poetic interludes, and then the kind of the detective style action. It was really cool. Like, and that was something that I didn't expect and was very different. Was like how he kind of waxes, it does these kind of monologues, and then how it changes. And then just as someone who makes a podcast, there was so much to listen to that was interesting to me of how they use music and sound effects, and then so much stuff that made me curious. And as I've listened to the episode a few times, again, struck by that, even if like on a subconscious level, how it really was theater of the mind. Like I was picturing replaying different scenes, and I could see them playing out and what people were wearing and stuff.
Yeah, I think, that unique kind of waxing poetic, the monologues, the purple prose, however you want to describe it, definitely sets it apart from other detective shows of the era, which is so much fun. And also, I think someone who makes, fiction podcasts today, a really hard thing is, bringing your audience with you from place to place, when you can't use visuals to say like, okay, we're at a different location now. And kind of hearing in this episode, there's very early on like an ambulance ride, and he's, taking you all over the city, and then like taking you to the police station, and it all kind of happens so fluidly that you don't even realize that it's happening if you're not paying attention. So pretty impressive.
Yeah. It's like, I always don't know what to call it, but it's like the idea of show, don't tell, like that they do it so well in this episode. And then I wasn't even thinking about it until you just said that, like that his monologues kind of create the environment, because since this was a holiday season episode, it was like they didn't have to add any more of those details because my imagination was filling them in. It was like, oh, they didn't have to talk about the weather too much or the sounds of the streets or set the total scene because the table was already set.
Yeah, totally. And it's funny, show not tell, because you can't really show. You have to tell. They just do these hyper specific details, and you get this bigger picture of what New York was like on the streets in 1950.
Right, yeah. And the monologue, how it's. I mean, I guess it's hard for me not to project onto the episode too, but it's like it's kind of like fun in a sense because it's like men in beards and red velvet suits or whatever, and it's like it adds a layer of like indirectness that makes it enjoyable, or whatever. Like, I'm a tough guy, and this is how I talk about Christmas, man.
Let's jump into that recap. So this episode, it's a bit tough. It's interesting looking online and like looking at information about like, okay, when did episodes air? You know, were there any official titles? A lot of episodes from, or a lot of, you know, radio shows from this era, it's like they don't have official titles, or you're kind of looking through different materials that might conflict. But as far as I can tell, this is generally agreed to be called the Ben Justin case. And it was originally aired on December 8th, 1950, which was, 72 years ago yesterday, as of recording, which is pretty crazy.
Wow.
Pretty sure every one of these episodes starts with some variation of I'll Take Manhattan, or Manhattan, whatever you want to call it, an old jazz standard. And it very nicely just goes into the car horns. And then, you know, every episode kind of starts with these iconic lines where he goes,
Broadway's my beat, from Times Square to Columbus Circle, the gaudiest, the most violent, the lonesomest mile in the world.
Good. Yeah, I don't know if I agree that that's the lonesomest mile in the world, but
maybe internally it's still like we're together alone or whatever. Especially now with everybody having their phones or their AirPods or whatever.
But I think like that sets the stage very effectively in terms of this, you know, kind of moody jazz number, and then you just get this thing of this vision of New York as kind of this hellhole of crime.
Right, it's like sets the environment, and then it goes straight into the action too, which I really like. It's like this is all you need to know, and New York Broadway's is a bad place, and here we go.
So yeah, so it starts with a Christmas monologue, as we've already talked. Larry Thor is Detective Danny Clover, who is our main protagonist here. I kind of find that there's two Christmas monologues here, one right at the start and then one after the commercial break, and both of them don't really connect with the rest of the plot whatsoever. So it's very much so feels like the writers had this story and then we're like, oh shit, it comes out on December 8th. We need to write something about Christmas.
Right. Oh yeah, we better shoehorn this in to set the mood so everybody will be happy.
When it's December and the winter has caught hold, Broadway comes up with a miracle. Silver trees grow out of the sidewalks. Men with beards and red velvet suits suddenly appear from out of the Bowery and dedicate themselves to being jolly. And reindeer roam the tundra of the spectaculars. It's a time of Crosby records, noses against department store windows, and wishing you'd kept up the Christmas Club payments. Everybody's happy. Even the finance company sends you season's greetings.
So the police have found a man dying. His name is Ben Justin. They find his wallet. He is still alive, and he was shot. An interesting thing, I saw someone note this in the comments section, actually on archive.org, but an interesting thing about this show is it reveals that first aid is just not a thing in the 1950s. Like, the police get there and they just watch this man die until the ambulance arrives, which is maybe accurate to today as well. But, you know, they get him in the ambulance, and Detective Danny Clover is trying to get Ben Justin to say who shot him. You know, he's kind of, I think he's lying there and he's, you know, saying like, I'm gonna kill him. I'm gonna get him. And he's like, who did this to you? Who did this to you? And then he dies in the ambulance.
Yeah, there's some great sound effects in there, which is something that is, and I guess do they record these shows like, did they record live, or was it like pre-recorded and then broadcast? I
think it was pre-recorded and then broadcast, but, you know, I don't really know a lot about old-time radio production. I'm pretty sure there were some shows that were more live in studio, but I'm pretty sure they, you know, this is so well sound designed that I can't imagine someone doing it live.
Yeah, and the sound design is like, there's actual Foley, or I'm assuming it's actual Foley. I did hear like a record scratch or like a little bit of a record sound, but I don't know if that's from the recording. I'm like, oh, are they playing sound effects on records too? And producing them, like, now we're in this age of practical effects and green screens, and I'm like, oh, there's practical sound effects in this thing. It's so cool. And yeah, and then it transitions to the ambulance. It does really help paint the picture. And then the ambulance sound and Justin's dying voice acting is it was all right. Like, but
we got another. I mentioned this Danny Clover monologue. Essentially, he's tracking the ambulance through the city. A couple of great lines here. He says, the rhythm of death is slow. They turn off the lights, so the ambulance is just driving, through the city regularly. So, he says, at a stop, because death in the city must wait its turn. And it really paints the picture of like, this uncaring urban environment where you have, this man who's just been murdered, and then like people just living their best lives, it's just surrounding the ambulance, which I thought was, sometimes it does feel like that living in the city where it's just like, you have no idea what's going on around you, and, tragedy and happiness, live side by side. So,
yeah. There's so much. This must have been where the writers just loved it. Like because they write so much dialogue, and then they're like, "Oh yeah, we get to really dive in here." And I wonder how much editing, like even the language is always good. It's like I think they used furtive glimpse of pain. Oh, I'm like, holy cow! And then it goes from the city to the police station. And this was a question I had too, which I didn't have a chance to research. It's like he's typing in triplicate. And I'm like, man, did you see it? Did they have carbon copies, or was he typing that up 3 different times at his typewriter? The non-romantic part of being Danny Clover.
Yeah, that's a good question. I noted that turn of phrase, and I was like, oh, I wonder like what the actual process was for having to type out all of these files. We get back to the police station, and then he goes out to see the widow of Ben Justin, who's Evelyn Justin. This was a little bit funny. I thought Evelyn Justin here, kind of a classic noir, femme fatale, very much inspired by that, but it seemed maybe it makes more sense once we know more information about her later, but it just seems so out of character, so odd.
No, I definitely agree. Like, it was like, I guess the benefit of re-listening to it over and over again is like, then you're a picture in like this bathrobe, like with a martini and stuff. But the first listen, it's like, wait a second, what? Like, yeah.
Ben didn't tell you? He was bleeding to death and he wouldn't tell you who killed him?
No, Mrs. Justin.
I like him for that. There are a lot of other reasons, but this one's the best.
Then you will want to help us find his murderer.
No, that's your job. That's what you get paid for.
They shot him down in an alley.
Sorry, but that's how I feel about things.
So if you're listening to this recap and you don't know what happens, it's very odd. If you do know what happens at the end, then maybe it makes a little bit more sense. We find out that Ben worked for Imperial Insurance down on the Lower East Side. She seems very anti-cop, which I guess puts her very much in the 2022 zeitgeist.
Yeah, it's just strange that she's like an obstacle, like you're saying, when it's like, oh, like, wouldn't you be? There's a lot of interesting emotions between her and the insurance company, where it's like, okay, wouldn't you be worried? Or she's like playing it tough, and maybe there's stuff cut from the show of like Ben's backstory that he was a tougher guy. Or maybe there was, I don't know, was there ever an old time radio show about a hard nosed insurance investigator?
Oh, there is actually. Well, if I'm remembering correctly, I think it's called Johnny Dollar, and it's really funny because his whole thing is that he has this expense account. So he has his rate, and then he has the expense account, and throughout the episode he's updating you on how much he's spent out of the expense account. But yeah, it is interesting. I mean, then we get to the actual insurance company, and there too, it's even a bit of obstacle, like you said. And I think you get kind of almost like a Law and Order or CSI vibe out of this, where the interviewee is like super nonchalant. He's talking about, I just want my coffee and breakfast before answering questions. And, he really has to kind of work it out of him. Like, do you know anything about this guy?
Yeah, the insurance guy that runs the insurance company has got to be the worst boss ever. Like, his top concerns are breakfast, that he didn't get breakfast. I can't do anything till I have my breakfast and my coffee. And it's like, dude, this guy who used to work here, he's dead. He got murdered. You're not even curious? No, well, after I get my breakfast, I'll be curious.
Yeah, I think if I worked for Imperial Insurance and got murdered and that was how my boss reacted, I would be pretty devastated.
Yeah, Adam, after breakfast, we'll cover his death in an alley.
So we get this whole backstory in terms of the Colton murder case. So this woman named Mrs. Colton potentially, allegedly, was murdered by her nephew and his wife for the insurance money. And so Ben was investigating that murder, apparently in parallel with the police. The cops couldn't find any proof that they had committed the murder, and neither could Ben. He turns in the paperwork, says they should get paid the $100,000 insurance payout, which I did not do the inflation math on this one, but that would be, I think, a lot of money today. And then he resigns from the insurance company. And then, according to the boss, they hear he's been running around with those kids, the Reed kids, the nephew and wife. I think you noted the phrase, they've been making merry with the Reed kids.
Yeah, it's so funny. I mean, that's just a classic, like, making merry. Like, say it in this diminutive way, but also it's just hilarious. And I guess if we had Johnny Dollar on the case, this would it would be resolved. But Ben Justin seems to have other motives.
Absolutely. Right from the get-go, we get this idea that there's something fishy about the murder case, the Colton murder case, and the way that Ben was involved in it. Mr. Kogan, who is the boss man at the Imperial Insurance Company, he does finally get a dime for his coffee from Danny, which would be $1.15 today, or they're $1.19 today, I think we've calculated. And you were wondering, you wrote in our notes here, how much is a coffee today? I walked past a coffee stall in the Upper East Side this morning, and a small coffee was $1.50. So a little bit of inflation, a little bit of greedflation, sounds like.
I'm sure that coffee was back then was very powerful, but the taste would take some adjusting today.
All right, so then we finally get to the Reed kids.
Oh.
This is Danny Clover, Daddy. He's from the police.
I'll be honest with you, Mr. Clover. I'm busy.
Well, just a few questions about Ben Justin.
Guess I'm right, Daddy, huh? Soon as I saw this morning's paper, I told you a policeman would be twirling his hat at the door.
Then you talk to him, Johnny. I've got to get my work done.
I'm afraid you'll have to hold it off for about 5 minutes, Miss Reed.
Do you have a warrant?
Very interesting characters. Right off the bat, Johnny, who's the nephew, kind of reveals, I know the drill when it comes to police questioning. His wife, Dottie, I believe I couldn't tell if it was Dottie or Dolly. I heard it both ways. But I'm going with Dottie because I think that's more fun. She's very skeptical and upset about Danny's presence, and they also say, they didn't like Ben Justin. Ben Justin thought they were buddy-buddy. I think he says something like, we shook hands at the end of the investigation. And he took that to mean friend.
They say, I think she says, we yawned, or he says, we yawned in his face. Is that when this is? Like,
yeah, they're like trying to get him out of the house.
Yeah, like he probably stayed past his their bed. They're like, dude, we got to go to bed. Like, we've got to get to the horse track tomorrow or whatever. And he just, Ben Justin does not come off well, I guess, in this.
Yeah, his wife doesn't care that he's dead. His boss doesn't care. The Reed kids are pretending they don't know him. Doesn't seem like the most loved guy in the world.
Right.
But yeah, so then Danny asks about the inheritance. Dottie gets hot. and kind of starts yelling like, oh, when are people going to leave us alone about this? You know, proven innocent, all that, yada, yada, yada. So Drew, you know, so far, how are you feeling about the plot? We've been introduced to all the major players. Do you have kind of an inkling of where things might go?
I mean, I think that you know, Johnny and Dottie do seem like a little bit. They're tough routine. I mean, definitely it's like, okay, will we hear from them again? Plus, I really enjoyed their like they really lean in. Like I was like, I don't know, both those characters, even though they're only in the show briefly, and I guess they're guest actors or whatever, it was just they were so fun. And so it's like, oh, I hope we hear from them again, because they're like, oh, you're not going to frame us, or there's just not even flowers, they say when they didn't go to his funeral. Like, yeah, I guess I was wondering, okay, I mean, they do set it up in a procedural way, like you're saying with CSI, and you're like, oh, is this a misdirection or not? Of like, oh, well, they got off in this one case on a technicality, but so we suspect them, and they're like, oh, it wasn't us. And I think traditionally nowadays that's kind of like a red herring. So I was like, oh, what is this? Like, where is this going? I mean, definitely you're rooting for him to bust somebody at this point. Because you're on Team Clover.
Team Clover, all the way. So we're going back, after this interview, back to the police station. Danny is poring over the transcripts of the Colton murder case. And so there's another police officer, Mugavin, who's the same guy that Danny was talking to at the top of the episode, who discovered Ben Justin, or got to the scene first. It's a funny little line. Mugavin is kind of like, oh, how many times are you going to pour over that transcript? And he offers him a detective pulp novel, one of those cheap, nickel or dime store novels. And he says, for 2 bits, it thrills even me, which I thought was pretty funny.
Yeah. It's like that. Is it like they're? Is that like? Back then would have been like something meta, like a little sneak joke too, of like, haha, like now you're tuning into it. It's cool.
So here's kind of, we get, all the details of the case here from Danny. And Mrs. Colton was killed with Johnny Reed's gun, but there were no fingerprints on the gun. He did have a gun for work. He was a messenger boy for a brokerage house. And so, Mugavin is saying, he needs a gun. He's got all this money and stocks on him. Like, he needs protection.
A boy needs a gun. That's just exact. I was like, that's another. A boy needs a gun. When he said that kind of career or whatever, I was like, oh my God. Work sanctioned. His work gave it to him.
Otherwise you'd be like, well, why does he have a gun? But, he says potentially the gun was stolen from him. The Reed kids say they were picnicking out in Jersey in the Palisades, and no one can prove otherwise.
Eating ham and cheese sandwiches. That was that's a detail at some point that comes up. I was like, oh wow, like they had their story straight. Like that wasn't I'm eating turkey and he's eating ham. So
yeah, and you found some nice pictures from the time period, which are pretty fun to look through. But a popular picnic spot is the Palisades, apparently.
Yeah, it looked beautiful.
The police didn't have evidence. The insurance company, which is, even more incentivized to not pay out this $100,000 than the police are to actually convict this guy, that pretty much got them off scot-free. And then we get a little bit of drama. We got Sergeant Tartaglia. I always get Gino Tartaglia, who's a bit of the comic relief clown kind of character. He comes in saying Danny needs to go to Evelyn Justin's house, and she just called in saying that someone was trying to kill her. And so Danny and Mugavin head down to Evelyn Justin's apartment. The door is locked. They ring the bell.
Lean on the bell, Mugavin.
Yeah.
Danny, something happened.
Kick it in. Mrs. Justin!
Watch it, Danny. The place is a furnace.
Mrs. Justin!
Danny, you can't go in there. Don't be crazy.
Yeah.
I don't understand. What happened?
We ring the bell, we blow the place up.
Yeah. Oh man, this was the first thing that felt a little bit melodramatic. First, he says right before they get in the car, "It's a cold ride," or "Grab your jacket, it's gonna cold ride." I mean, it's the story flows, but it's like you're not like an explosion would get my attention in some way beyond like we got to interview this lady one more time. But I just like the timing, and it was a cliffhanger because it's like, I mean, it's a pretty big cliffhanger, an apartment blowing up. Even nowadays, like it almost felt like there was a show called 24 that Kiefer Sutherland was in, and each season it got more and more over the top. But they would constantly, at every ad break, they had cliffhangers that you're like, I guess I got to watch because this doesn't make any sense at all. So I have to see why this happened or what the logic behind it is.
Yeah, was it ER or Grey's Anatomy where like a helicopter crashes into the hospital or something? Like, you always have to keep upping the drama. And this one was funny because it definitely felt like it just kind of came out of left field, where it's like there's an explosion, but like somehow the front door is totally fine, so they still have to kick it down, and then they get in there and it's like everything's on fire, but like the building is fine. And then even later, like, we'll kind of see like it doesn't seem to totally destroy all of the physical evidence. So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it was like out of the ordinary. So like it maybe creates word of mouth. Like you're like, did you hear it last night? No, I was listening to Hopalong Cassidy. What? They blew up, the apartment blew up. You got to listen next week now.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we're kicking to a commercial break here. You just mentioned Hopalong Cassidy. We got a commercial for a Hopalong Cassidy show tomorrow night. Every Saturday evening, Hopalong Cassidy. So I guess we're listening to it on a Friday. So what do we, I think we just checked in, but now we have another dead body on top of Ben Justin and Mrs. Colton. We kind of know the facts of this case. Now we're halfway through. Any theories, any kind of guesstimations on what might happen here in the second half?
I mean, I'm definitely now the stakes have been raised, so it's like, holy cow, now it really is like, even though Ben Justin died, and we're like, yeah, his boss, nobody cared about that except for, but now this apartment's been blown up. It's like, wow, there must be really something cool at stake here. So I think even though it's a bit ridiculous, it's like it was dramatic enough to be like, holy cow, like someone has some reason for blowing up Evelyn. So will we find out who it is, or is it going to be somebody new? So it worked in some sense, even though I'm joking about it. I was like, whoa, that's unexpected and big. Like what's going to come next?
Yeah, it's a bit unexpected because even though Evelyn was kind of weird up at the top of the episode, you don't necessarily assume that she's going to be involved and that she would need to be murdered in any way. I definitely thought it's a bit surprising where we're going to take it. Coming back from the break, we get another kind of holiday monologue, some jazz music. This is another kind of a weird one. He talks about the dissonance of death when everyone else in the city is celebrating Christmas.
It makes glints in the winter's sun, sways gently in the winter's wind. It makes you all warm inside, doesn't it, kid? The warm-eyed women walking by, hugging the warm fur close to them. Makes you merry. And the music floating out of the metallic throats. Good, huh, kid? But turn it up. That way you won't hear the dissonance of death. That way it won't intrude, that explosion uptown. Anyone killed? No one knows yet, but when they do, it'll be given to you. Hot off the presses, shining from the Translux. Gift-wrapped with red ribbons.
Yeah, this one he's talking like direct, because he says, "Doesn't it, kid?" or something. It's like he's talking directly to you on this one.
Oh, that's funny. I kind of heard it as he's talking to like a kid on the street. Like he's just kind of wandering the street, just kind of angry at any child that kind of comes across.
I like that.
So we go back to the apartment. So this is after the fire department has taken a look, or gotten the fire out. It's destroyed. They find Mrs. Justin's body in the kitchen. Danny somehow is able to, do some kind of like Criminal Minds or like Hannibal kind of mind palace thing and say like, oh, before she was blown up, she was beaten up first. She was knocked out cold, and then they rang the doorbell. So it's not their fault necessarily that they rang the doorbell and killed her. She was left to die, and so they rule it a homicide, which is the big twist here.
Call it into homicide because all those accidental apartment explosions that are the doorbell with the stove on. The pilot light goes out and the electric from the doorbell blows up the apartments. That was a common occurrence in New York.
Honestly, with the way that safety regulations were, all the janky electrical wires.
Right. Or your mother, like, it's like, oh no, don't get one of those electric doorbells. Like, a knocker's just fine for me. Too much risk. Like,
yeah, exactly. There's still like pretty much every stove in New York is still gas. So I'm surprised there aren't more apartment explosions. We go back to the station. This is our first real classic Tartaglia bit, which if you listen to more episodes of Broadway Is My Beat, you'll get to know and love the Tartaglia bits.
Hi-ho, Danny. I come bearing gifts from the boys in technical to you.
You thank them for me, Gino.
Goes without saying. Christmas is coming, Danny. Courtesy is the motto of the season. A fella has to...
Goes without saying. What have you got?
And we get these kind of two big pieces of info, which are Danny was correct. Mrs. Justin was beat unconscious before the police arrived. And two, the doorbell was rigged to a booby trap explosive. I thought that was fun. It's been a long time since I've heard the word booby trap. And it was not a professional job. It was clumsy.
He says it was a clumsy imitation.
Gordon didn't like it, huh?
He sniffed his nose at it. However, in the matter of an inferno machine, what matters clumsy, huh, Danny?
Yeah, this way, was a great example of that thing of like show don't tell in some sense, or tell us, because it's like so much is revealed about his character and how he interacts with Danny that I didn't even know all this, like that this is an ongoing thing. But Danny cuts him off. He's like, a poet once said, or whatever, and Danny's like, yeah, whatever. Like, also, since I make a sleep podcast, strangely enough, the timing, I just did an episode about a Star Trek The Next Generation episode called Booby Trap. And I was like, first of all, where did this phrase come from? It turns out that sailors would eat a type of bird called a booby, and that's the trap they used to catch them. But I tried to change it. I'm like, oh, is booby prize or booby surprise any less I'm like, how am I going to overcome this so it's not upsetting to people?
Yeah, to clarify the change, because it's funny you're saying, like, because it's like in your show when you do recaps, you try not to have anything like explosives or death or anything that as you're trying to fall asleep could be disturbing. It's funny that when you think of the word like booby trap, you're like, okay, I need to change the word trap. That's the word that's going to upset people, and so you come up with booby surprise, which I feel is a very different very different thing.
Yeah. I got, if you think about, I guess, yeah, it's like I think there is booby prize, and I was like, well, now I got to Google booby prize, because I think that's like when you throw darts. And you see this giant, like you go to a carnival and you see a giant bear, and you're like, oh, I want to win that bear. And then you pay $5, and they give you like something like you get out of in a box of cereal or a McDonald's toy that's a piece of plastic, and they're like, oh, I want the bear. They're like, oh, if you win 10 times, you could get the bear. Oh, by the way, the booby was rendered extinct by all those sailors that were out colonizing the world or whatever.
And that's a bummer fact that won't make it to Sleep With Me, as it might disturb you before going to bed. So then we get Danny asked Tartaglia, how did you know that the woman on the phone was Mrs. Justin? Which is, kind of a thing that, everything kind of happens so fast right before the commercial that, oh, we don't even think about that. And Tartaglia says, she said her name, several times. And he goes, what reason would I have to disbelieve what a lady tells me?
Does he say like, Gull or Gulliver. I tried to. So I was like, but some sort of be made a fool or something like that.
Yeah, he says like, "Oh, like you making a Gulliver out of me," or like, "Do you take me for a Gulliver?" And he makes another joke about it about Danny later when Danny gets a phone call. But yeah, essentially old timey way of saying like, "Oh, like do you think I'm a fool for believing what this woman told me on the phone?"
She said her name 14 times.
That is essentially the vision that we're getting here of this woman just kind of saying like, "Hello, it is me, Evelyn Justin. I am being murdered. Like, please come to my apartment right away." And again, just to reiterate, I am Evelyn Justin.
Please ring the bell because I will be occupied as I'm in the midst of a struggle.
So then we get a phone call. We get a Swifty Crenshaw. Incredible name. So Swifty is calling in from the 34th Street post office, and he's holding some mail for Mrs. Justin.
Who was it, Danny?
A Swifty Crenshaw from the post office.
Swift. Cren? See how you too can be a Gulliver, Danny?
So we get to the post office. We're looking through the mail. A few Christmas cards from people who heed our message to mail early. I thought that was funny. Essentially, Swifty is going through all of the mail, looking at what it is, what he can kind of get out of it. Postcards. I think you said some third-class mail in there. Free grease job. Just yesterday, she sent an envelope to herself. But Swifty Crenshaw cannot tell us what is in the envelope. So.
Yeah, but also, like, it's a little disturbing, some of these details, that Swifty spends most of his time, like, writing fan fiction about people's undelivered, like, he just goes through the post office box, looks at their stuff, starts to create stories or whatever. Oh, like, she's got a library book. And that he also knows, because he's tried to read the mail inside of, he's like, oh, you can't read that one because it's in a manila envelope. It's like, I tried to see what it was. We need to get another episode about the post office, an investigation there.
Yeah, for sure. You need like that Seinfeld level kind of thing where Newman is doing the whole post office investigation into Jerry. Yeah, I mean, this is like another thing. I mean, I feel like a classic kind of cop show kind of genre thing as well. I think if you watch any CSI or NCIS or anything, you always have these kind of character actors or actors that come in and do these bit roles that are just like kind of just wild, like really, out there kind of characters. And it's interesting listening to a lot of these radio shows because it's like these genre beats have not really changed over the course of 70 years. They're pretty much exact. You can imagine a Swifty Crenshaw who goes through the mail on, NCIS.
Right. It's like, and if you think about it, like this uses a music to do a transition too, where they've just cut down the amount of music they use to like 4 notes. But it's still like, oh, by the way, we're changing scenes and locations, bum, or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So we don't know what's in it yet, but Danny's back on the phone. He's talking to a guy named Mr. Jasper. So it seems like what was in the envelope was a carbon copy of a subscription form for Today's Lady magazine. And just an aside, I did look it up. I found that there is a magazine called Today's Women, which is still publishing, and it was around in the 1950s, but no Today's Lady. So if anyone listening to this, it happens to be a magazine history aficionado, knows whether Today's Lady magazine was real or just a made-up name so that they, wouldn't have to get sued by Today's Woman, please let me know. But the subscription form was signed by a DF, a guy named Donald Fraser. Mr. Jasper on the phone is very curious, and he said, well, why didn't he mail in this form? Danny gets the address for Donald Fraser and hangs up the phone. So it's an interesting, weird development, I think, also back in the day when people would go around selling magazine subscriptions from door to door. Did you ever have to sell magazines or did I know as a kid sometimes, I would have these things where we like sell magazine subscriptions as a fundraiser, which I always thought was the most ridiculous thing in the world. But
yeah, I remember doing that, and then it actually helped me, like, because like it's a little bit ahead, but they mentioned like points, like that. Not only maybe you got paid in points and money, but I was like, oh. Like when I had a newspaper route, which I had only a basic understanding that you were basically running a business. You're like buying the papers from the company or from your distributor, and then charging people more for the paper or whatever, and that's how you get paid as a paper boy. But there was also a point system there. But I was so terrible. I was not like somebody that was going out looking for new subscriptions. And so we would have like a picnic every year, and they would go through all the prizes. All these other kids that were more driven than I was, they would get like a new bike and a pogo stick, and it must have been with those points. So I found that caught my attention too.
That's really funny. That's it's funny to be the lowly paper boy who's not interested in running this child labor racket.
Right.
We move on. We're moving pretty quickly. We're moving into going to Donald Fraser's apartment. And Danny Clover is with Mugavin again, and we have this moment where they're at the front door, and Mugavin is kind of debating about whether or not to ring the bell after the trauma of having killed Mrs. Justin accidentally.
Yeah, he doesn't want to lean on the bell again, and then he gives that advice about. Crash in an airplane, go up in an airplane again, I heard. And I was like, on the internet? Like, are you from the future? Because, like, that sounds like a terrible idea to me. If I crash in an airplane, I'm never getting on an airplane ever again. Like, probably, without, like, a therapist who's coaching me through it. But and then it goes into, it keeps going. I mean, this is where listening really was rewarding, was even, like, this scene where they're kind of playing... like tough cop, bad cop is really fun and like to the genre, but also funny in a sense because his personality from earlier where he's constantly making all these side comments.
Yeah, they definitely do like a bit of a bad cop thing here because they essentially force their way into Donald's apartment. They're being very aggressive around, hey, we know that you filled out the subscription form. It was the same day Mrs. Colton was shot. That's the big reveal. The subscription was for Mrs. Colton, and it happened to be signed on the same day that she was murdered, or allegedly murdered. And so what we get out of this is that Donald witnessed that the Reed kids were there on that day with their aunt. Dottie signed the subscription form for Mrs. Colton. Then Ben Justin found this out and paid him $1,000 for that form instead of handing it into the company, which I think you did the math. So that would be around $12,000 today, $12,521.50.
Yeah. So I don't know if this is the moral of the story, but if you like sell magazines, because he didn't know they were going to murder, like he just said. Somebody wants to buy this thing off me for $12,000. Still not a good idea. Like even though it'd say this guy just wants to buy this off me, or how fast did he buy it off him, or turn in your subscriptions. I guess there's a lot of morals, but it's like I can't. If he didn't hear about the murder, $12,000 in today's dollars. For a person that's selling magazine subscriptions, that's a lot of money. And I don't know if there's a moral code of door-to-door salespeople that have to stick to. But, there's unintended consequences or he finds out in the end it was a bad idea.
Yeah, I kind of thought $12,000 is not enough money to get embroiled in a conspiracy around a murder. But, to each their own.
Yeah, probably good. That's a good life lesson.
I thought the timing was definitely interesting because it was like, okay, so, Ben Justin was somehow able to track this guy down after Mrs. Coulter was shot, within must have been just a few days. He hadn't, sent it into the company yet. Kind of an interesting thing. So we get to learn a bit more about Ben Justin here, which that he's a pretty opportunistic guy. So he's, who knows how old he is, but like he's been living his whole life. He's a insurance investigator, above the books supposedly. And then he just sees this opportunity in front of him where he says, "Oh, I can blackmail these murderers, and I can hold, you know, the only piece of evidence, which is this subscription, which is pretty interesting. It says a lot about Ben Justin, our initial murder.
Yeah, he's a regular gumshoe. He could have had his own show if he didn't get taken out so soon. He was taken from us too soon. Ben Justin. All those silk clothes, though, I'm sure. Yeah, he was like, this was his breaking point. Like, these silk clothes. I got a house full of silk dresses, silk bathrobes. I want a party with people that are more interesting. I'm not, obviously he's not as interesting enough for Johnny and Dottie. So it all came to a head for him with a magazine carbon copy.
So we're 22 minutes in with about 7 minutes to go. So they're very efficient storytelling so far. We just found out there's a witness tying the Reed kids to the murder. And not only that, but there's actually physical evidence that there's like a witness there. Ben Justin's involved with some sort of blackmailing scheme, but there's still no proof that's actually tying the Reeds to the Justin murders, which occurred in this episode. Even though it would make sense that they did, unless we find out that the Imperial Insurance guy was actually like, I hated Ben and I'm glad he's dead and I murdered him. So then we get kind of the big final scene, this kind of last 6 minutes or so. Danny heads to the Reed home. Danny separates Johnny and Dottie. They send Dottie to go get coffee in the kitchen. And he just starts making small talk with Johnny, nothing serious. Then he goes to help Dottie with the coffee in the kitchen. And he comes in and says, "You're under arrest." And she just starts laughing at him because the cops have already tried this tact on her before. They try to get them to confess. They say, Johnny just told me everything. Dottie, you're under arrest. Dottie and Johnny make moves to throw him out. When Danny says that he has an early Christmas present for them. It is the signed magazine subscription form, and it's proof that they were at the house, and the missing proof that the DA did not have at their trial. And Danny says, you thought that you had destroyed it when Dottie called headquarters, pretending to be Mrs. Justin, and had the police set off that booby trap. So I'm just gonna let my cats out of this room because they're crying now.
Meow, meow.
Meow. They were sleeping so nicely, and now it's getting dark. So they're like, all right, it's dinner time. So yeah, big dramatic reveal. Johnny scoffs and offers to pay off Danny. Danny doesn't take it. He wants them to sign a confession. And this I thought was a very nice, clever thing. Johnny has a gun, and it kind of... we only ever hear the dialogue. No narrator is ever coming in and saying like, oh, and by the way, Johnny has a gun pointing at Danny. But we get this like nice piece of dialogue that reveals that he has a gun pointed straight at Danny.
Merry Christmas, Danny. How much you want?
How much were you paying Justin before you killed him?
Don't bargain. How much?
All of it. Everything you got. I want you to sign a confession, you and your wife.
Let me sit down and think about it. Serve the coffee, Daddy.
You gonna stir it with that gun?
No. I'm gonna kill you with the gun. You want one slug or two?
Johnny!
This'll put you out of your misery, Johnny.
You can have half of it, Mr. Clover. All of it. You can have anything you want.
I've got what I want. Let's get your coat, Mrs. Reed.
Yeah, this was a really good scene. Like, I think her performance was so cutting. Like, she just tries to kind of humiliate him at first and laughs at him. Johnny takes his coffee regular, which is another... Is that just a New York thing, or is that a New England thing of, like, if you order a coffee regular, it's like 2 sugars and a cream. But he also drinks beer while his wife's making coffee, expecting an unexpected guest, because he had just opened a quart of beer, which is not 40 ounces, 32 ounces. I actually had to look that up. I was like, but it's like a big jug of beer. So they were getting ready to enjoy themselves, I guess, or just chilling out at a long day. And then the fight scene, Yeah, there's no setup for him. He says one slug or two, which was awesome. And then the fight scene was a little bit like slapstick, but just because how else are you going to do it and not have it be too loud or anything like that or too violent? But it also shows again that Clover's just like he takes out a guy with a gun, man. He's our hero. Tricks him and one-ups him.
Yeah. It is interesting listening to those kind of like action scenes. They don't last very long usually because exactly to your point, you get to a point where it's like, all right, we know what's happening. But it does make Danny Clover off to seem like a real hero with a real good punch. So that's the end. We get one last short monologue from Clover, doesn't really dwell on it too much. And then the credits roll. And then we also get a short ad for a new program featuring Edward R. Murrow, who is the famed broadcaster, known for saying good night and good luck and all that. So
yeah, I liked that setup. And then just that this is the end of the season, which they say series, like they still use in the UK. Like I was like, oh, like it's like I'm not sure when we'll be back, but so not of how long a break isn't clear. But that makes sense too because it's the end of the holiday. I mean, the holidays is when most shows take some sort of hiatus.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wasn't able to find. Well, I was looking back to the episodes that we do have. It looks like they came back in April of the next year, and then I'm not sure like if there was really a standard season for shows that the way at least for a while with TV, it was like, okay, new TV shows start in the fall. They take a little break during the holidays, come back in the spring. You get your full 22 episode season that happens from fall to spring. Then you have like a summer season or whatever.
Yeah, I was trying to look up. I mean, there was one thing I found about that period where it was like talking about the expenses of making a show. And it was like half of the expense was, it's funny for the internet, like it was they didn't call it bandwidth back then, but it was like the charge from like AT&T or whoever to like use their line to send it out or whatever, wherever they were sending it. And then the other half was the production costs. And it's like, oh, wow, that's just so wild. Like, and it seems like, yeah, that they didn't have a lot of ads. So it probably was the kind of thing of like one or two advertisers. And maybe I was reading that too, could sink or swim a show and be like, okay, you don't smoke enough. Danny Clover needs to smoke more if you want us to stay on, or wash his clothes more.
Yeah, there are some shows. So I've listened to a couple other shows from the era. So like Dragnet and This Is Your FBI is a good one, and that one is, if you're thinking about like propaganda, This Is Your FBI is like directly working with the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover to like make these like wonderful about how great the FBI is. But it's a good show because they do use actual FBI files, so they are interesting. It is, yeah. It's funny, they all have different advertisers, but a lot of them will have the same advertiser for like a really long period of time. So, either there's a life insurance company that the Equitable Life Society has done advertising on one of those, and then cigarettes are a massive one, of course. And then if you ever listen to old Superman cereals with an S, they also advertise cereal with a C. And like toys that you can get in cereal, and it's like, oh, it's really not that different than what it was like growing up, at least in the 2000s, thinking about getting a toy in your cereal.
Right. It's like if kids say are missing out on anything, it's a constant programming of eating sugary foods between being entertained or fast food. Be like, okay, like this is what I was trained for. Is associate my entertainment with sugar or easy to acquire calories.
Exactly. So, end of the episodes, big takeaways in terms of Broadway Is My Beat or this story. What'd you think?
I think I really liked it. And I like Danny Clover. And I guess for me, the draw would be more of the Tartaglia too, of like, okay, like the re-listenability. But this would be something that's nice. I could see it back then of like, oh, every week I'm also looking forward to spending an hour with Danny Clover. So it was fun. And I haven't listened to a lot of these detective shows, and it was just also cool to see how structured the story was, but how also it kind of fits in today. And it's weird because I've been reading, I wouldn't call it pulp, but it's like John D. MacDonald. He wrote these novels in the 70s. They're all really short. And I have dyslexia, so it takes me forever to read. And they have he's not a detective for the police. He helps people that, are beyond, he helps people recover money that's been stolen from them that the law can't help. And I just got to the point where I read enough in a row where I was like, oh, he's about to solve something. I'm like, oh, somebody's going to surprise him from behind. And nevertheless, he gets hit from behind. But it's still fun. I guess that's why TV today, that's like one of the enduring shows on broadcast TV is like different types of procedurals, medical or investigative.
Yeah. It's the same thing if you listen to a lot of Broadway Is My Beat and other procedurals of the time. Like, it's pretty obvious who did the crime. Like, there's not a lot of like, oh, was it this person or was it this person or was it this person? Not like that kind of classic Sherlock Holmes thing where it's like, oh, the mystery is completely up in the air until the last 5 minutes or whatever. But you do definitely, within the first 10 minutes, we understood essentially what was going to happen. You just need the proof.
Yeah. So is a lot of the Broadway Is My Beat episodes like where you have the sense of like these two deserve a fall, like Johnny and Dottie, like where you start to root against them. Like you're like, okay, I really want him to catch it. Can they outfox Danny Clover? The answer's no. Call homicide. It's call it in.
Not always. There was one episode that I considered for this recording that was a little bit more of like a kind of a mental illness situation where like she couldn't really help it, and then it was her sister trying to like just cover it up so that she wasn't like sent away to a mental institution. And it is the 50s, so it's like you can definitely empathize with that of like I would probably cover up my sister's murder so that she didn't go get lobotomized in some institution as well. So it's pretty interesting. I definitely think I don't think that was necessarily the text of that show. I don't think that was you were supposed to be rooting for the sister, but it's definitely not as clear cut of like, oh, all of these people are horrible as this episode was.
Yeah. So not like some modern TV shows I'm thinking of like where it's like, oh, I love the show. I can't stand anyone on it. Like,
yeah, it's interesting. Yeah. You're not really meant to, I don't think you empathize much with the criminal.
In the midnight cold, Broadway echoes with sounds you hear only in darkness. The fleeting whispers that speckle places where there's no sun. People pass and touch you. You look down, there are fingers of dust on your shoulder. It's Broadway, the gaudiest, the most violent, the lonesomest mile in the world. Broadway, my beat.
Thank you, Drew. Where can everybody find you if after this they want to have something nice and relaxing to fall asleep to?
Yeah, I was trying to think of like a version of this story for Sleep With Me. You could, if you have your podcast app that you're listening to this show, and Sleep With Me podcast is the name of my show, you can find it there and check it out. It's a bit strange, but hopefully if you're looking for something to fall asleep or keep you company and old time radio does not fit the bill, check it out.
Cool. Thanks, Drew.
Thanks again. Next time I see you will be on the Great White Way, hopefully.
On the lonesomest mile in the world. Thanks again to Drew Ackerman for joining Broadway Is My Beat, Is My Beat. You can find his podcast, Sleep With Me, in pretty much any podcast app, including maybe the one that you're using to listen to Nightwater. Broadway Is My Beat, Is My Beat. I also want to thank the Old Time Radio Researchers Group, who have put together hundreds of collections of episodes of old time radio shows on archive.org, freely available for anyone to listen to or download, along with some great additional resources and information about the shows. If you like this podcast, let me know at nightwater.email, and make sure to hit that subscribe button. If you're feeling especially generous, you can sign up for a paid subscription to help support the newsletter. You'll get special bonus materials on a monthly basis as a thank you. And also, I'll just thank you. Email me. I'll send you a thank you. I'll say thank you. This has been Broadway Is My Beat, Is My Beat. The gaudiest, the most violent, the lonesomest old-time radio show in the world.
Dan Coverly speaking. This is CBS, the Star's Address, the Columbia Broadcasting System.